Everyone, my name is Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet on Daf Yomi, a joint project of Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha. What we'll be discussing today is actually a sugya that has tremendous practical implications in a lot of different spheres. We're really in the parak of Chullin that is the kind of the most practical in terms of what our day-to-day lives look like. These are the sugyot that get at all the nitty-gritty of what happens in our kitchens, the mistakes that we make when we mix up the meat dishes and the dairy dishes, and how long we have to wait between eating basari and eating chalavi, etc. And the sugya that we'll be exploring today really gets at the heart of the question of when packaged food that you buy in the supermarket has hashgacha that says that it's meat or dairy equipment. What does that mean? And what are the implications of that halakhically? And where does that come from in the Gemara? So the sugya that we'll be doing today is the sugya of not bar not, which really the core of that sugya is on Kuf Yud Aleph on the bet, but as we'll see today, some of the discussions in the Rishonim connect it to the following sugya that comes up on Kuf Yud Bet about a davar charif, about sharp foods. Like as many of you probably know, most of the problems in a kosher kitchen only start when there's an onion in the equation. So we'll be looking at how those two sugyot relate to each other and some of their implications for halacha l'maaseh. So let's get started with the sugya itself on Kuf Yud Aleph, about a case of dagim she'alu ba'ke'ara, which what we're talking about here is fish that was prepared in some way in a meat bowl. And the word alu, right, that we're going to see that it means probably placed here, and Rashi's going to say that explicitly, but the question is going to be sort of how much purchase that word really has, right? How much stake we place halachically in the fact that the Gemara chose to use the word alu here rather than something else, we'll see. But we're talking about fish prepared in a meat in this meat bowl. Rav amar asur lo'achlan b'kutach. So Rav prohibits eating those fish with this dairy dip that they called a kutach. And Shmuel amar mutar lo'achlan b'kutach. And Shmuel said, no, food's parav, you can eat it with a kutach. Why? Rav says it's asur because it's notain ta'am, right? We're assuming here, for all intents and purposes, that we're talking about a ben yomo meat dish, meaning that the meat dish has been used for meat in the past 24 hours, and therefore there really is taste that was kind of transferred to the dish, and therefore, says Rav, it could get transferred from the dish to the fish as well. And Shmuel says no, it's mutar. Why? Because it's notain ta'am bar notain ta'am, which means it is a two-step taste transfer. Meaning, right, meat had to be transferred into this dish, and then subsequently the meat taste from the dish had to be was then transferred out to the fish, and at that point, Shmuel seems to be saying there's something that has kind of been weakened, or it's enough steps removed that two-step taste transfer isn't enough to render this par of food meat. It's important to note, by the way, that two-step taste transfers can obviously make something treif. The question that we're trying to figure out here is whether or not they can take par of food and make it meat. Right? If I take dairy and put it in my meat bowl, obviously the taste that is transferred from the meat to the bowl and then will then subsequently be transferred from the bowl to the dairy and will treif up my food. Right? That's even though that there are two steps there, right? This is right the distinction, the way that it's described in the poskim is not bar not de isura versus not bar not de hetera. Right? The reason why Shmuel is willing to permit here what he calls not bar not is because this is not bar not de hetera, meaning it's two steps of taste transfer that are all heter, right? That are all permissible. Right? Nothing's treif yet. The question is just whether these fish are pariv or are meat. And Shmuel says that a two-step taste transfer can't make something meat enough to now get treif if you eat it with a kuta, for example. So that's the sugya that we've got here, and we'll see how Rashi describes the case and how he explains what's going on. So Rashi on the sugya he says dagim she'alu ba'ke'ara, right? He's going to translate the word alu for us, right? Alu min hatzlik shehayu rotchim netanam b'toch ha'ke'ara she'achlu ba'basar, right? So you're taking hot fish roasted, and you're taking it from the fire or from wherever you were roasting it and putting it in this meat dish. So, right, what two things that he's noting here: one, that it's hot, right, and Toast was going to explain why that's important that it's hot, and B, that it came kind of from the place where it was being cooked, in this case roasted, and into this dish, and it wasn't necessarily cooked in this dish itself. Then what Rashi says is asur lochlan bekutach lefisha basar notain bahem tam. So the reason Rav is prohibits it is because look, there was taste transfer. You can taste some meat in the fish. And Shmuel says notain tam bar notain tam hu. Right, it's a two-step taste transfer. But says Rashi, im hayu mevushalim im habasar mamash. Right, the fact that it's a two-step taste transfer is the reason why it's fine. Obviously, if the fish had been cooked with meat, right, then it would be asur lochlan bekutach. Then it would be prohibited to eat it with a kutach. Now Tosafot's gonna go into trying to understand exactly what Rashi is saying, and then we'll see that Tosafot's going to bring a another shita, and try to explore, right, how these two positions relate to each other. So Tosafot, starting with Hilchata dagim shalu bakara shel basar mutar b'lochlan v'kutach, or Tosafot's actually talking about the end of the sugya where it becomes clear that we actually paskin like Shmuel, despite the fact that typically in cases of isur v'heter, and in cases of permissible versus prohibited actions, we typically hold like Rav. In this case, we hold like Shmuel. It's clear from the Gemara. Right, so going back to what Rashi said about them being hot, right, this is Tosafot saying this wouldn't even be a question if everything was cold. Right, there's no one there would be no machloket. Even Rav would be modeh in a case when everything's cold, as you probably know. Again, most problems in the kitchen, right, most kosher problems don't really arise if everything's cold, with again the exception of onions, but that's for a later Gefet. Debeni lagvar ben tatagvar klipa mihabai, right, this gets into a different conversation, but right, Tosafot is noting that if something's hot, it could, right, that's where the potential problem starts, right? It might make a difference whether or not the hot thing is the plate or the fish. That relates to a different sugya, but either way, right, and that might make a difference as to the scope of the problem, but either way, you would need at least, right, there would be potential for bli'ah, right, potential for taste transfer, that would go at least as far as kedei klipa, at least as far as like a little bit that you could peel, right, and as which he says kind of based on the sugya and psachi. So all those what's saying here, it's important that something at least to be hot if for the question even to come up, and that's why maybe Rashi said, just so you know, right, alu min hatzlik sheheyu rechlik. Then Tosafot continues, b'shem Rashi pirish rivan chotno. Pirish rivan chotno dafka alu shar aval nidbashlu asur kichad tamachashi. So, right, this shita of the rivan, that, right, Rivan is the chatan of Rashi, is the son-in-law of Rashi. So we've got this shita of the Rivan, that the word alu, which Rashi explained as meaning it came from the fire into the kara. The Rivan says that's dafka, meaning specifically it is that case that Shmuel is willing to be matir. Shmuel is only willing to permit in a case of alu. Aval nitbashlu asur kichad tamachashi. But what if it was actually cooked in the meat dish? Meaning, what if instead of a case where I roasted my fish directly on the fire and then put them in a meat plate, what would happen if I had a pot and I cooked the fish in a meat pot? So the Rivan, is going to say that is prohibited, right? That is considered not barna, but that is considered chad tama, only one notain tam. So, right, seems like there was this actual real life case that happened, that instead of talking about fish that was placed in this meat thing, we had eggs that were actually cooked in a dairy pot, and the ruling was, nope, you're not allowed to cook them. You're not allowed to now put them in your whatever the meat dish is in muliyata shabasar. I'm actually not sure. So, imagine a chullet or something like that, right? Dairy pot, you made eggs. Not allowed to use those eggs, put them in a chullet. V'yesh lahavi raya ali dvarav. Okay, so now we're talking now. So now we've got this shita of the Rivan that is a little bit more right. That seems to be a little bit more machmir, right? That says that the word alu specifically is talking about a case where there wasn't actually a heat source in the moment that was connecting this meat dish and the fish. And now this question is going to be like, okay, where does he get this from? Where's the Rivan getting this from in Rashi? The yesh lahavi ra'aya lidvarav mitznon shechatacho b'sakin de'asur lo'chlo b'futach mishum de'agav chorfa balat. So now Tosafot is taking us to the following sugya, the sugya on the next amud, really on Kuf Yud Bet Amud Aleph, in which there's a case described of cutting a radish with a meat knife. So if I cut a radish with a meat knife, says the Gemara, it is prohibited to eat it with a kutach, right? Despite the fact that dagim sha'alu ba'ke'ara are permitted to eat with kutach, a tznon shechatacho b'sakin, right? A meat knife, presumably. And this is really the sugya of a davar charif, of sharp foods that we're all familiar with, that you can't eat with a kutach. Now, the proof, right? The proof for this shita of the Rivan, says Tosafot, right, might be from an explanation of that case, one of the explanations of that case, which Rashi gives, which is mishum de agav chorfa balatve v'chashiv kechad tama. Right, that because the charifut of the tznon, of the radish, makes it absorb taste more, and it's considered like chad tama. And then says Tosafot, v'nit bashlu lo gar mitznon, right? Right, thinking about where there's right, if you imagine that the sharpness of the tznon turns and the duchka of the sakina, meaning the pressure of the knife, together, that sort of the pressure of the knife and the sharpness of the food are considered to like make something that's even cold basically hot and allows for taste transfer to happen. Says the Rivan. Well, at least or say Tosafot here in the name of the Rivan. Cooking is certainly, there's as much heat taste transfer happening there as there is with cutting with a knife. Even cutting a sharp food with a knife. So there's a kal v'chomer here from the tznon case, right, from where everything's cold, but there's a sharp knife, right, a pressure from a knife and sharp food. So there's a kal v'chomer to a case where I'm literally cooking these eggs in a pot. Right, that. So again, here the alu means, just to summarize briefly, alu means placed in a meat dish specifically, and if they were cooked in a meat dish, the fish would become meat. That would be considered one taste transfer. And now we've got this raya from the case of the tznon. So let's just quickly go and understand what Tosafot is referring to here in the Perush of the case of tznon. There's a Rashi on this case that Tosafot understand as providing two different reasons. It's not totally clear. I'll just sort of say in parentheses, it's not totally clear from the Rashi itself that Rashi is understanding these as two alternative reasons, but that's how Tosafot understand it, and that becomes sort of the dominant understanding, the halacha, that there are these two understandings in Rashi. So Rashi sort of explaining this maskan of the sugya, right, on the one hand about the tznon, and about on the other hand, right, the radish, and on the other hand about the fish, dagim shalu bakara. So hilkach dagim shalu bakara mutar lo'chlam bekutach. It's fine with with the fish. Kida amar de'in noten tam habami hamamash ela noten tam habami noten tam. Right, it's not one noten tam, not one knot. It's two knots. It's not bar knot. Because right, we generally clean our pots, so there's no literal meat residue getting out of the fish. But for a knife, it's different. Why? One, because right, we've seen knives, especially serrated knives, like there can be guk residue, little grease that sort of gets stuck on the knife. You don't necessarily see it or notice it. And then what's happening when you're cutting the radish? It's netinat ta'am that's not coming from ta'am. It's not taste that was balua basakin. It's not taste that was absorbed in the knife. Rather, it's taste that was coming from real meat grease that's on the knife. So it's really one knot. And right, the ode, he says, and this again is where Tosafot is understanding this as a second reason, but it's not totally clear that it's a second reason exactly. But right, he adds on, Demishum chorfe balat femi dagim harotchim, ve'agav dufka de sakina palat sakina ubalat snon. Right, that the harifut, the sharpness of the onion makes it absorb more than fish, and because of the pressure from the knife, the knife is polate ta'am, it sends the ta'am out, and the snon absorbs it. So, right, Tosfot's understanding this as there are really two reasons here. One is the knife is dirty, right, and therefore the radish can absorb ta'am. Number two is is something about the sharpness of the snon, right, makes it the case that even the taste that is balua in the knife gets shot back out, and that is enough to aser it. So again, going back to the Rivan, right? The Rivan's position is that, well, if you actually cook, let's say, the eggs in the dairy pot, that right is as much right, that has to be a more serious taste transfer, or at least as much of a serious taste transfer as the knife. And if you understand, like Rashi's second reason here, that what's happening with the knife and the radish is taste transfer coming from what was absorbed in the knife back out to the radish, then certainly the eggs are going to be a problem. Mihu, says Tosafot, le perush lashon acher shepiresh kuntrus tetama asur mishum tashuman parush al sakin. But if we understand the radish case as a product of actual meat residue on the knife, right? Then have a tam rishav it's known ein rayamishan, right? And that because of that, then there's real actual meat residue being absorbed in stone. Then of course you can't bring a proof for the Rivan from that. Then okay, right? The knife case is talking about whether there's actual residue in a pot, whether or not you're putting in the pot after it went on the fire, or you're actually cooking in the pot, right? There's no actual meat residue, and it's a two-step taste transfer. So those are right. That's how those two different positions in Rashi about the radish would have implications for our sugya about the dagim. Now Tosafot's going to tell us what he thinks Rashi actually thinks. So we took Lashon HaKuntris, from the actual language of Rashi, it sounds like Rashi thinks that I don't care whether you're just placing it off the grill or you're actually cooking it, like the eggs case. Why? Yael gabe notin tam bar notin tam pirush kuntrus im hayum mevushalim im basar mamash ola echol chalav right ola echol chalav bekara or modish modasur. Right, that the important part is the first half of that sentence, right? That when it came to the not bar not sugya, when it came to the fish sugya, what did Rashi say? Rashi said it would be a problem if the fish had been cooked with meat, with actual meat. It sounds like from that dimavushalim im basar hu asur aval mavushalim im kara shari, that if they're cooked with actual meat, that would be a problem, but being cooked in the meat pot would be fine. Right, the same rule applies. Tosafot says, Tosafot is reading into Rashi's actual language that the same rule would apply even if the fish were cooked in a meat pot, right? And only if they were cooked with meat do they become flitshim. Right, and going back to Rashi itself, right, when Rashi on that last line here, notin tam bar notin tamhu, im hayuv mevushalim im basar mamash haya asur l'ochlan b'kutach. If they were cooked with meat, then you couldn't eat them with your dairy dip. Mashma, right, it sounds like if they were cooked in a meat pot, it would be fine. So just quick summary, and then we'll see how this is nifsak lahalacha. So is the word alu, is that a dafka? Does that mean specifically only if they were taken off the grill and put in this meat dish, or would it mean also if they were cooked together? According to the Rivan, yes, only if the fish were actually placed in the meat dish. Whereas according to Tosafot, Rashi on Kofiyud Aleph, but really Tosafot's read of Rashi on Kofiyud Aleph, no, even if they were cooked in the meat dish. So what's the case that Shmuel would permit? The Rivan thinks, right, only when there's no actual heat source connecting the para food in the meat dish. Whereas according to Tosafot's understanding, it's even if it would apply even if there were a heat source. Okay, so then what would Shmuel have prohibited? The Rivan thinks any case where there was a heat source connecting them. So you cook your eggs in your dairy pot, your eggs are dairy. As opposed to Tosafot's position, right? No. Only if the para food was cooked directly with meat. And then, right, again, why is the radish a problem? So according to the Rivan, we understand that the radish is a problem because there was taste that was absorbed in the knife, shot back out into this radish. And and that's a problem. Kal v'chomer, you have eggs that were cooked in a meat pot or cooked in a dairy pot, shot out of the pot, absorbed back into the eggs. Whereas according to Tosafot, no. The reason, right, we if we can explain away that case as being a case of residue left, of meat residue left on the knife, and that's the reason why that's known as a problem. So now, what is the heter of not bar not according to the Rivan? Right, parv hot food placed in meat ben yomo dishes, right, and any heat source can transfer strong enough taste from dishes to parv food to render it meat or dairy if there's a heat source, like a heat source. But hot food on meat dishes is not enough to do that. Whereas for Tosafot, no. Parv food cooked in ben yomo meat dishes, that's not bar not, it's parv. And right, only meat or dairy food can render parv food meat or dairy. So let's just look quickly at how this is nifsak lahalacha. So the Shulchan Aruch says dagim shenipashlu o nitzlu b'kedera shel basar rechutza yafeh. Right, he says you have to make sure it's washed. Can't have meat residue on it. Right, she'ein shum shuman davuk ba. Right, there's no guk stuck to it. There's no grease stuck to it. Mutar le'ochlan bekutaf, right? You can eat it with your dairy dip. Mishum tehave notin tam bar notin tam tehetera. It is part. Sephardim rule like Tosafot here. I'll put in parentheses here that there is still a question about whether or not one can do this like super lechatchila, right? Lechatchila here means right now I've got this part of fish, let's say. Am I allowed to put it in my dairy dip? But can I, if I'm trying to make fish for my dairy meal, right? The question of whether or not I can do that lechatchila in a ben yomo dairy pot, a ben yomo meat pot, is still going to be up in the air. The Achronim have questions as to how to properly interpret the Shulchan Aruch here, even for Sephardim. Rabbi Ovadia, I believe, is Mekil, but there are those who are machmir about that. But that's all for Sephardim. Once the food's cooked, once this parv food is cooked, even in meat equipment food, go ahead and make it right and put it in your lasagna. I don't know. Go ahead. Whereas the Ramah says something slightly different. Yesh machmirin b'tzliya bishul la'asor notin tam bar notin tam. So there are positions that are more machmir here, namely the Rivan. So the custom is to be choshesh for the Rivan lechatchila. Lechatchila here, by the way, meaning that meaning even after I've cooked the fish. Right, the question of lechatchila or b'diavad is, can I now go put it in the lechatchila question that the Ramah is referring to here is, can I now put it in my dairy dip? U'b'diavad mutar b'chol inyan. Right, b'diavad meaning I made a mistake. I put it in the dip. Now the question is, do I have to throw it in the garbage or can I eat it? Totally fine to eat it. Meaning we're choshesh for the Rivan lechatchila, but b'diavad we're okay. And he also notes dafka lechol im chalav v'habasar etzmo v'litzanan b'kli shelahen mutar lechatchila v'chein hagu. So right, even the chomer like the Rivan is only about actually eating it with your dairy dip, but you can, if fish that was made in this meat pot, you can totally decide to now put and heat up in your dairy dishes. And also he notes here v'chol zek she'ama chalino davar charif. It's interesting to note here, and also this is a parenthetical that I wish we had more time to get into, that despite the fact that Tosafot understood the Rivan's position as basically being dependent on, right, or as the question of the Rivan, right, whether alu is dafka or lav dafka, was dependent on how you understood the sugya and harif, dependent on how you understood what's the reason why the radish became aser. The Ramah is machmir like the Rivan, but he's also machmir, right, he's machmir like the Rivan lechatchila. But even though b'diavad he's mekil there, he's not b'diavad mekil like the reason that goes with, right, like Tosafot's understanding of what the reason would have to be in the charif case. So in the charif case, he's going to be machmir even b'diavad, you'll see. But when it comes to the actual not bar not normal case of the fish, he's going to be mekil b'diavad at least like the position of Tosafot. Okay, one sort of final little discussion that gets to another kind of halacha l'maaseh moment that also has to do with not bar not. At the end of this Tosafot, Tosafot takes us to a new case about ke'arot shemishtamshim behem basar shehunchu b'machavat shel chalav b'kli rishon u'shnehem b'nei oman yesh la'asor. So, something that you might think is not bar not, says Tosafot, but I'm going to tell you it's actually not bar not. What's the case he's talking about? The way that they used to wash dishes is you would take this really, really big pot, fill it up with boiling water, and not even fill it up with boiling water. You would boil water in this really, really big pot, and then you would take all your dishes and you would dump them in the pot of boiling water, and you would swish them around a bit, and that would wash your dishes. So if I've got a really, really big pot that's dairy, and then I take meat dishes, and I'm washing my dishes in this, washing my meat dishes in the dairy big pot. Tosafot says this is a problem. Because for a couple of reasons. Afilu im nomar lav davka alu ela afilu nitbashlu, right? Even if we rule against the Rivan that the heter of not bar not even refers to a case where you actually cooked them together. So ima shamnu nitba en al karot to have a kasakin shaloni kanaf that right to aser precontrus the lashon acher. So first of all, there's a problem of you might actually you're washing dishes. The dishes that you're washing are dirty. They have guk on them. So that's going to be a totally different story. There's real be'en. There might be real meat being transferred here, and then if the real meat touches the dairy pot, then you're in big trouble, and that's a problem. Right? Even if we're talking about a case where, let's say, I don't know, we rinsed everything first, so it's just there's no actual be'en on your dishes. It's still a problem. Why? So he brings two possible reasons why it could still be a problem. Right? I would think not bar not. Right? It's the meat was transferred into the plate, and the plate is now getting transferred to the water. Everything's still parv. The water can't become meat from the plate because it's not bar not. Same thing with the dairy pot. The dairy pot is absorbed dairy, and now it's transferring into the water. Shouldn't be enough to make the water dairy either. So that would be my thought of not bar not. So he says no for two reasons. One, so we're not only concerned about taste transfer into the water, which is parv. We might be concerned about direct taste transfer between the meat pot and the dairy pot, right? In a case of dagim shalu b'ke'ara, there was no meat and dairy anything that were in contact with each other. There was meat and parv, and the question was, could the meat make it parv? So here there's a potential problem of direct taste transfer. It's a question whether or not this reason ultimately has purchased the halacha, because in general we say that why is it that the taste could transfer from the meat pot to the dairy pot? Because of the water liquid that was in between them. Right. And so theoretically, you kind of need that intermediary water in order for anything to be a problem. But that's one explanation that Tosafot gives. And the second explanation that Tosafot gives that I think becomes even more important. Right. It's actually not similar to the fish case at all. So here you have basically two quasi not bar not things happening at the same time, almost like from the opposite direction. If you imagine the water is receiving not bar not dairy and not bar not meat at the same time, right? So it's not that it's not really not bar not de hetera. It's not that dairy to water, right? Dairy to pot and pot to water, everything, right? The water is still parv, and meat to plate and plate to water still parv. No. Right, once those things are happening at the same time, then the water is absorbing meat and dairy at the same time, and then becomes treif. And then once the water's treif, right, then we're not in not bar not to hetera land anymore. The water isn't parv or flesh. The water's treif, and once the water's treif, it can treif up everything. So it can treif up the pot, and it can treif up the bowls. So if one of them's in a benyomo, it's a more interesting and easier question, but that's not lenient. Right now, we're assuming that everything's ben yom. Question is going to be how this too is nifsak lahalacha. Right, the Shulchan Aruch says actually is more lenient than Tosafot, and this becomes the psikav Sfaradim. The Shulchan Aruch says no, this is not bar not case. I don't care that the water is absorbing dairy at the same time as it's absorbing meat. It's not really absorbing dairy or really absorbing meat. Both of those absorptions are not bar not absorptions. And because they're not bar not absorptions, then the water basically stays parv the whole time, as long as, of course, everything's clean. So here's how he says it. Right? So if you wash your dishes by accident in the wrong pot, everything's fine. As long as, right, mishum de have a notin tam bar notin tam de teira, because everything that the water absorbed, right, the water absorbed not bar not meat and not bar not dairy, so meaning it didn't really absorb meat or dairy. Vihushi Omar, but that's only if this is if a person can say barili shelo haya shum shuman davuk bahen, right? This is only if the stuff was clean already. You've rinsed them off already. There was no actual meat or dairy on them. Imaya shuman davuk bahen, obviously it's a problem. So the Mechaber is basically willing to accept Tosafot's first kind of premise or first reason there, but rejecting reasons number 2 and 3. The Ramah is going to say no. The Ramah is going to rule like Tosafot. Right? Even if nothing is, even if everything's more or less clean. Right? If something's zeno ben yomo, then you're in it's an easier sell. But and you wash them together in kli rishon, hakol aser. Everything's treif, because again the water became not bar not meat and not bar not dairy, but the water became two-step treif. Two-step treif is a problem and can treif everything. Just notes that obviously this only really becomes a problem if what you're talking about is a kli rishon. With there are reasons to be a little bit more makil, let's say with sinks, because it's a case really of irui kli rishon, but that's for another time. The real this really touches the sugya of dishwashers, which obviously whenever you want to try to take the halacha as it is nifsaka in the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah and see how it applies to modern technology and reality. There are going to be a million questions about how exactly the dishwasher works and what how much water gets used and how does the water get spritzed onto the dishes, and is there actually like real food gunk caught in the trap, and all of those questions. But ultimately, in terms if you want to read all of the chuvot that have been written about dishwashers, meat, dairy dishwashers, what happens if you accidentally put a meat dish in your dairy dishwasher that's running a dairy load, something like that. What treifs things up and what doesn't. You have all of the kind of basic principles and basic ekronot that you need, and the ultimately the questions that one would still need to explore would be questions of what's the mitzias of how actually does this machine work. So hopefully now we've got a little bit more of a basis for understanding some of what's going on in the kitchen. If you buy food that says it's meat or dairy equipment, then you'll that now you understand a little bit what that means. Not bar not meat or dairy. Although I will tell you, when it comes to the OU's meat and dairy equipment, designations. I'm not sure how davar harif fits into that. So you'll have to ask your local OU or Star K or whatever it is representative. But hopefully now you have some of the foundations for thinking about some of these questions as they pertain to your kitchen. Thanks so much, and see you next week.